In 1942, in the scorching sands of North Africa, British tank crews first encountered a machine that overturned all their ideas about armored vehicles. Shells bounced off its frontal armor like peas off a wall, and its 88mm gun pierced any British tank from a distance where return fire was simply useless. This was the Tiger, a heavy tank created by German engineers for absolute dominance on the battlefield. At that moment, the British had absolutely nothing to answer it with. The crews of Matildas, Churchills, and Crusaders watched in horror as their shells ricocheted powerlessly off the steel sides of the German machine, while in return came a precise and deadly shot, leaving only a blazing wreck of the tank. It was after these first encounters that the British military command realized something had to change, and change radically. But before seeking an answer, they had to understand the enemy. Such a chance arose in early 1943 in Tunisia. During the fighting, British troops managed to capture a fully functional Tiger, stuck in the mud and abandoned by its crew. This machine became a true gift for military engineers and intelligence. The tank was immediately transported to England, where it was disassembled down to the last bolt. Every millimeter of armor was measured, and its gun and chassis were tested on the range. The test results confirmed the worst fears. The Tiger's frontal armor, 100 millimeters thick, was practically invulnerable to standard British tank guns of that time. Firing at it head-on from an ordinary 2-pounder or even a 6-pounder gun was pointless, except perhaps from the most minimal distance, which one still had to manage to approach alive. However, the British already possessed a weapon capable of piercing this beast's hide. The 17-pounder anti-tank gun, caliber 76.2 millimeters, proved brilliant in tests, confidently striking the armor of the captured Tiger at real combat distances. The problem lay elsewhere. This gun was bulky and heavy, and installing it into the turret of existing British tanks without major modifications was impossible. Then a temporary but ingenious solution was born. Take the American Sherman, the most mass-produced Allied tank, widen its turret, and literally cram the 17-pounder in there. Thus appeared the Sherman Firefly, a machine that could finally fight the Tiger and Panther as equals in firepower. The Firefly performed excellently in Normandy in the summer of 1944. German tank crews quickly learned to distinguish it from an ordinary Sherman by its long gun barrel and tried to destroy it first because they understood that this machine represented a real threat to them. British crews even resorted to tricks, camouflaging the long barrel of the 17-pounder so that from a distance their tank looked like an ordinary Sherman and did not attract the primary attention of German gunners. But for all its firepower, the Firefly remained essentially the same Sherman with all its flaws. The tank was too tall, making it an excellent target. Inside, it was unbearably cramped, especially with the huge breech of the 17-pounder, which took up almost the entire space of the fighting compartment. Most importantly, the armor remained as thin as a standard Sherman's, except for a small additional 76mm plate on the gun mantlet. Any Tiger, Panther, or even a Panzer IV with a long gun could easily strike the Firefly at normal combat distance, not to mention the Panzerfausts with which German infantry were abundantly armed. The British command understood perfectly that the Firefly was only a temporary measure, a forced compromise, and not a full-fledged answer to German armor. A completely new machine was needed, designed from scratch, which would combine powerful armament, reliable sloped armor, and sufficient mobility to act as an equal to the best German tanks. In 1943, when the data on the captured Tiger was fully analyzed, British designers received a task that sounded extremely simple: create a tank capable of destroying a Tiger in a head-on battle and withstanding the return blow of its 88mm gun. The task was simple only in words, but in practice, it meant a revolution in British tank building, because nothing like it existed in Britain at that time. Thus began the project that would eventually turn into one of the most legendary combat vehicles of the 20th century. The assignment to develop a new heavy cruiser tank, designated A-41, was officially issued in 1943, and engineers began work with a clear understanding of exactly which enemy they had to defeat. On the designer's tables lay detailed reports on the tests of the captured Tiger, armor schemes of the Panther, ballistic tables of German guns, and a detailed description of exactly how British tanks died when meeting these machines. Every millimeter of the future tank was designed not in an abstract vacuum, but with a specific goal: to stand against the 88mm shell of a Tiger and respond with guaranteed destruction. The first and main question was the armor. Designers carefully studied the experience of the Germans, particularly the sloped armor of the Panther, which allowed for a significant increase in effective thickness through the angle of inclination with a relatively modest plate thickness. The decision was made unequivocally. The frontal armor plates of the A-41 must be positioned at rational angles of slope, and their thickness must be at least 3 inches, that is, slightly more than 76 millimeters. This was a fundamentally different approach compared to previous British tanks, where armor was placed almost vertically and worked only through its thickness. Sloped plates gave a double advantage. A shell hitting at an angle had to pass through a significantly greater thickness of metal. Furthermore, the probability of ricochet increased, especially at long distances. There were no questions about armament. The main caliber was the already proven 17-pounder gun, which had shown its ability to strike any German equipment on the battlefield. But the designers went further and decided to give the new tank additional armament that had never been on any British machine before. In the turret next to the main gun, they planned to install an automatic cannon of 20mm caliber, the Polsten system. This rapid-fire gun was intended for fighting lightly armored vehicles, German reconnaissance armored cars, half-track transporters, and open anti-aircraft mounts. The idea was not to waste expensive heavy 17-pounder shells on targets that could be destroyed in a much more economical way. When it came time to order a prototype, the command ordered the manufacture of 20 machines, but not identical ones, rather in 3 different configurations to determine the optimal variant in practice. The first 10 prototypes received the classic combination of the 17-pounder and a coaxial 20mm automatic cannon. The second group of 5 machines was equipped with a 17-pounder and a coaxial Besa machine gun instead of the automatic cannon, as well as an emergency hatch for the crew. The third batch of 5 tanks carried a different main gun, a rapid-fire 77mm gun and a bow machine gun controlled by the driver. This approach allowed for the comparison of different layouts in real conditions and the selection of the best one before starting mass production. The new tank was named the Centurion in honor of the commanders of the Roman legions. This name proved prophetic, as the machine was to command the battlefields for several subsequent decades. In terms of mass, the Centurion turned out to be a serious machine. Depending on the modification, it weighed from 42 to 47 tons, which placed it in the same league as the heavy tanks of that time. At the same time, the maximum speed on the road was 22 miles per hour, which was slightly higher than that of the Firefly. Its maneuverability on rough terrain turned out to be simply excellent. In tests, the Centurion surpassed even the British Comet, which was considered one of the best tanks of the final period of the war. But here began the main problem that nearly buried the whole venture. British industry was loaded to the limit. Factories were producing Shermans, Cromwells, Comets, and dozens of other types of equipment needed at the front right now around the clock. Switching production capacities to a completely new, as yet untested tank in the middle of a war would have been madness, so priority was given to serial machines, and the 20 prototypes of the Centurion were built last on a residual basis, using capacities that could be carved out between main orders. Months went by, and the prototypes were still not ready. 1944 ended. The Allies had already crossed the Rhine and entered the territory of Germany itself. At the factories, turrets were still being mounted and engines were still being installed on the first Centurions. Only in April 1945, when the Third Reich was already living its last days, were the 20 prototypes finally completed and handed over for testing at the Chertsey Proving Ground in Surrey. Engineers and military personnel looked at these machines with mixed feelings. On one hand, a truly magnificent tank had been created. On the other, the war was clearly approaching its end, and the window of opportunity for combat use was rapidly closing. In the spring of 1945, the Western Front was collapsing at such a speed that staff officers could barely keep up with moving the flags on maps. After crossing the Rhine in March, Allied armies flooded deep into Germany, and the resistance of the Wehrmacht became increasingly chaotic. Large formations were surrounded, lost contact with command, and surrendered by entire divisions. The most grandiose catastrophe for the Germans was the Ruhr Pocket, into which Army Group B, the last large German grouping in the West, fell in early April. On April 18th, it ceased resistance, and 317,000 soldiers and officers surrendered. This was more than the Germans lost at Stalingrad. It effectively meant that organized defense in the West had ceased to exist. On the left flank of the Anglo-American offensive, Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group was operating. The Canadian First Army was methodically cutting off German Army Group 10 in the northwestern Netherlands, blocking it in a narrowing pocket from which there was no exit. The British Second Army was delivering a rapid strike north deep into German territory, pursuing the retreating remnants of the German 1st Parachute Army. On April 14th, advanced British units began to encounter units of the German 12th Army, which was rolling back, no longer thinking of serious resistance. On April 19, British tanks reached the Elbe, and a week later, on the 20th, Bremen fell, one of Germany's largest port cities. But the ultimate goal of the British offensive was not Bremen or even the Elbe. Montgomery aimed for Hamburg and further into Schleswig-Holstein to reach the Baltic Sea and intercept Denmark before Soviet troops entered. This was no longer just a military task, but a strategic one, determining the post-war balance of power in Europe. Every day of delay meant that Soviet divisions were moving further west, and territories that could still be occupied today might be on the other side of the future demarcation line tomorrow. It was in this atmosphere of a feverish race against time that a decision was made in the headquarters that could have changed the history of armored vehicles forever. 6 of the latest Centurions from among the newly completed prototypes were selected for dispatch to the front. The command wanted to test the machine in real combat and at the same time demonstrate to the troops that Britain had a tank capable of fighting any opponent as an equal. The crews for these 6 machines were drawn from elite units of the Guards Armored Division. Men were selected from the 4 most prestigious Guards regiments: Grenadier, Coldstream, Welsh, and Irish. Command of the combined group was assigned to Captain Sir Martin Beckett, a baronet serving in the Welsh Guards. He was an officer with an impeccable reputation and combat experience, entrusted with machines that cost huge amounts of money and several years of design work. Training took place at the range in Chertsey, where the guardsmen mastered the completely unfamiliar equipment. Each crew had to learn the specifics of control, sighting devices, the loading procedure for the 17-pounder, and the operation of the 20mm coaxial gun. There was practically no time for full training. It was assumed that the tank crews would perfect their basic skills already in field conditions on the way to the front line. The Centurions were being prepared for loading onto landing ships in Southampton. The route was laid across the English Channel to Antwerp in Belgium, and from there by their own power to the location of the forward units. Every day brought news of the rapid advance of the Allies. Hamburg was already almost in British hands. German garrisons were surrendering one by one, and everyone involved in sending the Centurions understood one simple thing. If these machines were not at the front in the coming days, they risked not catching the war at all. The question was literally whether they would make it or not. It was not a matter of months or weeks, but of a few days, each of which could be the last day of the most terrible war in the history of mankind. The guardsmen hurried. Technicians worked around the clock, but time was the main enemy, which could not be defeated by skill or courage. On May 8, 1945, Germany signed the Act of Unconditional Surrender, and all hostilities in the European theater ceased at 23:01 Central European Time. At that moment, the 6 Centurions were still in England in the final preparation stage for dispatch. Captain Beckett's guards crews never got the chance to test their machines in action. The war for which these tanks were created ended literally before their eyes. The 17-pounder guns of the Centurions did not fire a single shot at the enemy. It seemed that the story could have ended there. The tanks would have gone back to the range, and their combat debut would have been postponed indefinitely. But the command judged otherwise. The war was over, however. Britain still maintained a huge occupation army in Germany, and the question of rearming this army was as urgent as ever. The old Shermans and Cromwells that had gone through the entire campaign from Normandy to the Elbe were worn out and obsolete. The Soviet Union, yesterday's ally, was rapidly turning into a potential enemy, and its tank armadas, equipped with powerful T-34s and heavy IS tanks, stood on the other side of the demarcation line. British troops in Europe needed modern equipment, and the 6 ready Centurions represented an ideal opportunity for large-scale field trials in real European conditions. The decision was made quickly. The tanks were still going to the continent, but were transferred to another unit. Instead of Beckett's guardsmen, the machines were received by the 5th Royal Inniskilling Dragoon Guards, an Irish cavalry regiment with a rich combat history, part of the 22nd Armored Brigade, and stationed in the town of Griburm in northern Germany, in Schleswig-Holstein. The Inniskillings were experienced tank crews who had gone through the war from start to finish. It was up to them to squeeze everything out of the new machines that they were capable of. On May 14th, 6 days after the surrender, the 6 Centurions were loaded onto tank landing ships in Southampton. The journey across the Channel and the North Sea to Antwerp took 5 days, and on May 19, the machines rolled onto the Belgian shore. But the most difficult part of the journey was ahead. The Centurions had to cover almost 400 miles under their own power through all of Belgium and the Netherlands to the regiment's location in Schleswig-Holstein. This was not just a march, but the first serious road test for machines that until then had only driven on range tracks in Surrey. A column of 6 heavy tanks moved northeast along the broken post-war roads of Europe. Bridges were damaged or hastily restored by engineers. The road surface was missing in many places, and settlements along the way were in ruins. For prototypes that had not yet gone through a full cycle of factory tests, every kilometer of such a route was a check on the strength of all components and assemblies: engine, transmission, chassis, and suspension. The drivers led the machines carefully, listening to every unusual sound, and technicians on accompanying trucks were ready at any moment to stop the column for repairs. The route lay through towns and villages where the local population saw these unusual machines with their characteristic sloped armor plates and long gun barrels for the first time. The Centurion was strikingly different in appearance from the familiar Shermans with their high vertical sides and rounded turrets. The new British tank looked low-slung, predatory, and modern. Even to an inexperienced observer, it was obvious that this machine belonged to a completely different generation. Day after day, the column moved north, and kilometer after kilometer, the prototypes proved that the design solutions built into them worked not only on paper. The Rolls-Royce Meteor engines, based on the legendary Merlin aircraft engine, pulled the 40-ton machines confidently and steadily. The Horstman suspension softly handled the bumps of the broken roads. The tracks held grip on both wet cobblestones and muddy dirt roads. By the time they arrived in Griburm, the column had suffered only 1 engine breakdown and 3 transmission failures. This was a result considered simply outstanding for absolutely new, unseasoned equipment. The Inniskilling Dragoons received the 6 Centurions with unconcealed interest. From that moment, Operation Sentry began, which was to finally determine the fate of the tank. Operation Sentry started immediately after the arrival of the machines at the regiment, and the Dragoons set to work with the enthusiasm of people entrusted with something truly special. The testing program was drawn up as strictly as possible. The Centurion had to undergo testing in the same conditions in which British tanks had fought during the last year of the war. For comparison, a Sherman and a Cromwell were placed alongside. These were the machines that formed the core of the armored regiments and whose strengths and weaknesses the crews knew by heart. In addition, the American M26 Chaffee light tank, considered one of the best light tanks of that time and noted for its excellent mobility, was included in the trials. The first stage of testing took place on the roads of Schleswig-Holstein, where the tanks were driven on highways, back roads, and forest tracks, measuring speed, fuel consumption, load on the transmission, and ease of control. On hard surfaces and cross-country, the Centurion proved brilliant, confidently outpacing both the Sherman and the Cromwell. The machine ran smoothly, handled turns easily, and the drivers noted that controlling the new tank was significantly simpler and more intuitive than its predecessors. However, when the tests moved to swampy areas, the picture changed. On soft ground, the heavy Centurion sank deeper than the lighter Cromwell and Chaffee, and was inferior to them in its ability to overcome boggy sections. This was the only but noticeable flaw that engineers carefully recorded for improvement in serial models. The second stage was gunnery, and for this, the column moved to the Lommel artillery range in the Belgian province of Limburg, near the German border. This place was well known to veterans. It was here in 1944, during Operation Market Garden, that fierce battles for the crossing took place. Now the peaceful range was set with targets of a very special kind. On the firing lines stood knocked-out and abandoned German tanks, gathered from the fields of recent battles. For the Centurion crews, this was a symbolic moment. The machine created to destroy German armor could finally show what its gun was capable of, albeit not in battle, but on the range. The 17-pounder did not disappoint. Shells confidently hit targets at various distances, piercing the armor of the captured machines exactly as calculated by the designers on the blueprints. The accuracy of the gun and the ease of the gunner's work received high marks from experienced tank crews who had previously fired from the guns of Shermans and Cromwells and could compare. The results of the firing were documented in detail and sent to the War Office as proof that the armament of the new tank fully met the requirements. After the completion of firing at Lommel, the 6 Centurions went on a sort of tour of British bases in occupied Germany. The machines moved from garrison to garrison, and tank crews of various armored regiments were given the opportunity to inspect the new equipment, sit in the fighting compartment, and evaluate the view from the turret and the layout of instruments. The feedback was almost unanimously enthusiastic, but there was one critical remark that was repeated again and again. The coaxial 20mm Polston cannon, installed next to the main gun, caused serious dissatisfaction among the crews. It took up too much space in the already not-so-spacious turret, complicated the work of the loader and gunner, and its practical value in battle was questioned. The crews unanimously said they would prefer an ordinary coaxial machine gun, which is easier to maintain and does not restrict the crew's work. This opinion was taken into account, and the 20mm cannon did not make it into the serial version of the tank. In July 1945, the 6 prototypes made their final European march from Germany to Calais on the French coast, from where they were transported back to Britain. The overall result of Operation Sentry exceeded all expectations. Over hundreds of miles on the roads of 3 countries, the machines demonstrated high reliability and endurance, and the crews of the Inniskilling Dragoons in their reports characterized the Centurion as the best tank they had ever worked on. In December 1946, after improvements based on the test results, the Centurion was officially adopted into the British Army, and its serial production began under the conditions of the developing confrontation with the Soviet Union. Its baptism of fire took place just 4 years later on the other side of the globe, among the Korean mountains and rice fields. The first victim of the Centurion in real combat turned out to be absurdly ironic. The British tank, created to destroy Tigers, opened its combat score by knocking out a captured Cromwell, which had been taken by the North Koreans from the South Korean army and used against the United Nations forces. Thus, the tank that was late for one war found its own war and began a journey of 60 years of service, 13 modifications, and a dozen armed conflicts around the world. If you like this story, be sure to give it a like and write in the comments. How do you think an encounter between a Centurion and a Tiger would have ended if those 6 machines had made it to the front after all? Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episodes.